Today we're going to replace the alternator on a 2003 Hyundai Sonata with the 4-cylinder engine. If you look, the alternator is right down in there. A little tricky to see there. So the first thing you always want to do when you're changing an alternator is disconnect the battery. Always make sure that the negative battery terminal is disconnected. And on this alternator, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the battery cable from the back of the alternator. You can see somebody already pulled up the plastic shroud on it. The battery cable is a 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter nut. I was able to get it with a 1/4 inch ratchet, with a 13 millimeter socket on it. So if you reach down here, you pull this is the charging cable off the back of the alternator. Okay, always again make sure that the negative battery cable is disconnected before you do that, or you will short something out. There'll be a lot of sparks flying. Alright, so the next thing we got to contend with here is this tensioner. You can see right here. Here's the bolt for the tensioner. So if you move this out of the way, you can see on the front of this there's a 12 millimeter bolt. There you go. Move the camera there a little bit. You can see this this bolt here is a 12 millimeter. So we're going to loosen that or remove it, and it's going to able to let us turn this bolt so that we can move the alternator, so we can take the tension off the belt. We will also have to loosen the bolt on the bottom of the alternator to get this done. If you have one, these ratcheting wrenches seem to work the best for this job because it is in a tight spot. So let's see if we can get down in there. Let's see. Righty tighty, lefty loosey. There you go. All right. So now that bolt is loosened up at least. The bolt on the back, this adjusting bolt, is also a 12 millimeter bolt. So we're going to turn that. You can see, I'm going to hold this tight so you can see that whole thing's coming loose now, so that's good. Okay. All right, we'll use that later to adjust the tension on the belt once the new alternator is installed. So what I'm going to do now is just pull this whole thing out. Grab this here. Okay, so that is the whole tensioner assembly with the top bolt for the alternator. Let's put that aside. Okay, lastly, you can see we cannot see the bottom bolt for the alternator from the top, so it looks like we're probably gonna have to remove the right front wheel and try to get it that way. I do want to make a note, there is another connector on the back of the alternator. I can't really get the camera down at the moment, but I'm going to try to get a picture of that later so you can see. Make sure we get that off before we try to pull the alternator out so we don't damage any wiring. Alright, I wanted to show you, you come down here low, if we take out this bolt here and this shroud, actually we can get a really good view of the back of that alternator. Let's see if we can find it in here. Maybe I should have taken out that shroud before I started filming, huh? That would have been smart. Okay, we'll do that first. Alright, with that shroud kind of pulled down out of the way, we can actually get a really good view of the bottom bolt on that alternator, which is right up there, okay? So there it looks 14, 15. I don't know, we'll figure it out in a second. I'll pull it off. Alright, so that lower alternator bolt is a 14 millimeter. I was able to get on it with a deep socket with a 3/8 ratchet and an extension. I can get right on it there. So we'll pull that bolt out and we'll try to get this alternator out of here. Okay, if you can see this here, the lower bolt on the alternator had a stud, a nut on it. I pulled the nut off. It had a lock washer and a flat washer. Now we need to get this stud out. The alternator's loose, so I can move it around, but I got to get this stud out without damaging it. It's very difficult to get to the back of it. So we're going to knock that stud out, but we want to be real careful not to damage the threads. So what we're going to do is put the nut back on it first. Sorry about my light there. Okay. So there's the stud. Here's the nut. I'm just going to thread that back on there. And what we're going to do is try to tap very lightly on the nut only. And lube. Lube is your friend here. Hold on, let me go get some. That seems to have worked swimmingly. So now, take that nut off, and I could probably pull that right out. Excellent. All right, so the next thing we want to do is kind of rotate the alternator forward and take the belt off. Slide that belt right off the pulley. There you go. All right, belt's out of the way. And anytime you're changing an alternator, I recommend you change the belt. This one is actually fairly new. Somebody just changed this belt, so we'll probably just leave this one. Alright, now for the fun part. Is this coming out the top or the bottom? It really does look like the bottom. But if you get underneath this car, there is no room. So, what I've done up here, I'll try to point the camera, is I've disconnected a few connectors here. This is the fuel injectors here. This is the EGR solenoid, and something else over here, just right over here in this area, just to get them out of the way. I don't want to do any damage. There is a looks like a power steering line right here, and that is held on into a bracket with a little bolt right here, a little 10 millimeter. So we're going to pull that out just to kind of get some wiggle room on this, and I'm going to see if this thing will come out the top. Alright, so that bracket gave me actually quite a bit of wiggle room on this line here. Obviously, you want to be careful not to damage it, but I can pull this line almost all the way up out of the way, which gives me a pretty big hole to pull that alternator up, although I'm still not sure it's coming out the top. So, let's see how it goes. Alright, so one thing very common to the alternator is this ear right here. These ears, they always get stuck because they're a little bit, it's a tight fit. So I'm going to stick a screwdriver or a pry bar right in here and just try to pry that off of there. And then when it goes to installing it, I'll show you a trick to getting that in every time. There you go. Alright, the alternator is loose. Now, let's see if all my hard work. Yeah, this is okay. So, what's in the way? So, what am I hitting there? I'm hitting a wire harness. This power steering line that I said was in the way. You know what? We're going to take off the top cover of the engine, this plastic cover, so that I can pull this power steering line further up out of my way. I don't want to I don't want to damage it here. I don't want to force it here. So let's just here. Let's see. Let's see how far out of the way can we get this without doing harm. All right, got accelerator. Got all the cruise control set up here in the way. Let's see. Okay, that's tucked up out of the way there. Nice, right? These connectors all out of the way. That's a pretty big hole right there. If I could push this harness out of the way that way, I mean that's a pretty large hole right here. I should be able to. So you can see once I put the camera down, it was a little easier to get the alternator up this way around that bracket. I actually did not have to take this this bracket off, thank goodness. And it looks like I can wiggle this up and out this way. Again, I'm gonna have to put the camera down, but it looks like it'll just make it. Worst case scenario, I might have to unbolt this cruise control bracket, but it will come out this way. So let's see if I can find a place for the camera here. And just very carefully finagle this upwards. Okay, so just for safety, I am going to remove this cruise control setup. It just looks like it's real easy to get out. A couple of 10mm bolts here. And one right down here on the side of the shock tower. It also has a ground wire going to it, so you got to be careful to make sure this ground wire goes back on it. Okay, so with that up, I can move this whole setup way out of my way here. I could unplug it, just a word of caution. I don't like to unplug too many things if I don't have to, when they're old and brittle. Because it's where you run into broken connectors, so you just gotta be real careful and use your judgment. Let's see if I can finagle that thing up this way. There it is. The alternator comes out the top. All right, so we tested this alternator before we pulled it out. Obviously, it was not making enough volts to charge the battery. I wanted to point out a couple things. One, there was another connector on the back of this alternator, so you want to make sure that this comes off before you try to pull this alternator out, or you will damage some wiring, and that wiring is not easy to get to. Okay. Two, quick, easy diagnosis all the time of anything with a pulley on it. It should not be making that noise. So it's definitely got bad bearing in it. And then we'll show you on the new alternator when it goes in. Right here, there's a little ferrule. Let's try to get that on the camera a little better. There's a little ferrule that sticks out that makes this fit in that bracket real tight. Okay, that's on purpose. So what we want to do when we put the new alternator in is push that ferrule out a little bit. Okay, and then put the alternator in place, put the bolt in it. And then once we tighten that bolt up, it will draw that ferrule back in to make this a tight connection again. So that just makes the installation of this a lot easier. Okay, so you can see on the new alternator, that ferrule is actually already recessed out the back of the alternator. So that works out perfectly. So as I tighten up that bolt, you'll see it'll draw that ferrule in and make this a nice tight connection. So let's get this thing installed. Going in is much easier. All right. Let's get the bolt. This is the bolt from the back of the alternator, so I'm going to slide that in as I put the alternator onto that bracket. got that in. Now we're going to get the that bolt with the nut in front of the alternator. You can't see it from the top here. We'll go back down to the wheel well. Okay, so we're going to install the lower nut right here on the alternator. Okay, and here was the setup. We had a flat washer on there first. We had a lock washer on there next. And then we had the 14mm nut that held it in place. And when we do this, we don't want to tighten this up just yet, because we're going to need to rotate that alternator to get the top bolt in first. Okay, so now that we got the alternator in, you can see that I can rotate it because I got that lower bolt in place. I don't have to worry about it falling out. The next thing I'm going to do is get the belt on. And it does look like it's easier to get that belt from the bottom, so I'm going to do it right down there real quick. Alright, belt all the way on the pulley there. Okay, now with the belt in place, I can install the top bolt and the tensioner in the alternator, and we can get it set up. Alright, once we have the alternator in place and we have the belt on it, we want to install the tensioner and the top bolt for the alternator before we tighten anything up. Okay, you can see that this part of the tensioner slips into this little slotted hole there, and then there's a slotted area right here that the top bolt for the alternator goes into. So we're just going to take that down here and carefully thread that in. Okay, once you've got that thread in place, you can put this down where it needs to be. Okay, and we're going to just spin this in by hand. Okay, and then before we tighten the bolts for the alternator, we want to adjust the tension on the belt. This is a 12mm head on that. Again, I'm using my ratcheting wrench here. It's going to make that nice and easy to adjust. Maybe just a little tighter there. If you leave it too loose, the belt will squeal. If you make it too tight, the belt could break. So you want to make sure you're checking it as you're tightening it up. Alright, one more. This does not have to be super tight. Just want it done right. Okay. Alright, so there we go. Alright, so now we're going to tighten the alternator bolt. Again, it's a 12mm. I'm going to use the same wrench here if I can. This is the top bolt for the alternator, and then we're going to go tighten the bottom one. And we'll put everything back together, and she should be good to go. There you go. Alright, so with the alternator tight, I'm going to reconnect the battery cable and the electrical cable to the back of the alternator. So the electrical cable just snaps in. Kind of feel around there for the plug. You want to be real careful. Don't force it. It should go right in. Otherwise, you bend the pins and all of a sudden you're diagnosing the same problem over again. It's there. It goes this way. It goes with the clip on top. And you'll hear it click in. There you go. A nice solid click there. Okay, and then we're going to put this on there very carefully. You want to make sure that this is not going to touch any other grounds. As a matter of fact, the plastic housing came off of that. We're going to grab that real quick, put that back on the cable. This is that plastic that's covering the positive cable off the back of the alternator. Just make sure that we put this back on, because this keeps it from touching any other metal pieces and shorting out. So let me put this together here. See if I can do this with one hand. This kind of just slips onto there. Okay. Nice. And then we'll bolt this cable on, and then we'll be able to slide that back down in place. Okay. And that is just a 13 millimeter nut. You want to be real careful not to over tighten it. There's a nut and a lock washer came with the new alternator. Alright, that's tight. Let's get this plastic cover snapped back on the right way. This gets snapped closed, and that's it. That is protected. Oh, it keeps unsnapping this. We might have to fix this. Maybe zip tie this. Get it to stay on there right. There you go. Actually, it looks good. Alright, so with the alternator done, I'm just going to reconnect all these little connectors that I pulled off earlier, and put the cruise control module back, and hopefully this thing will run and charge the battery. Okay, of course I mounted the camera wrong. I gotta move it in order to get this power steering line back in. This goes back underneath the cover here, tucked in nice. Okay, that insulator goes down there. Okay, and don't forget this little ground cable for this that goes on the cruise control module bracket. So we mount this back over here, all nice and nice. There you go. All right. Control module back in. Okay. We're all back together. Alternator's in. Everything's tightened up. Start it up. Gotta put the battery cable back on and give it a whirl. So now the alternator's in, everything's connected. What we're looking for is about 14.5 volts with the engine running, and that's exactly what we got. The battery light is no longer on the dash, so we're all set to go. Well done.